Welcome to Traveling with a Chair. Today we're going to have an interesting conversation with Tori Hunter, and she's volunteered to be with us as a guest today. So Tori, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ken. So my name is Tori. I'm 24 years old. I use an electric wheelchair. I have a neuromuscular disease called spinal muscular atrophy. So my muscles have gotten weaker over the course of my life. So I do rely on the electric wheelchair, and I have personal care attendants that travel with me and they help me with my day-to-day living. And I have a blog and an Instagram, and I really just love traveling, and that's really always been my passion. I was really lucky that were the type of people that really knew the importance of travel and really liked to take myself and my siblings on family vacations. So I got introduced to the world of travel really young, and I'm very grateful for that. Just through my blog and my Instagram, I like to share my travel stories and travel tips with other wheelchair users, especially electric wheelchair users, because I think there's not a ton of representation in that space for travel with electric wheelchairs. I think a lot of the times when someone says, oh, this tour is accessible or this boat is accessible, it's yes, if you can step out of your chair and fold up your manual chair and get on this tour bus. And that's just not a reality for me. So I really like to share travel tips for folks like me that are a little more reliant on their mobility device, who are not able to get out and navigate stairs at all. Because it definitely changes the world of travel when you are fully dependent on your device. So I just love sharing my travel tips and tricks, and I'm happy to be here.
Thanks. It's great to have you. So you've taken a couple of trips recently. So let's just talk about your trips and see what went well and what didn't go well. I learned a lot from the things that didn't go well. So you went to Hawaii. So tell us about that.
I did. My friend and I, we actually recently went to Hawaii. We just went to Oahu. And then also, I guess it was 2 years ago now, I also went to Maui. Yeah, I've been able to explore 2 of the islands on Hawaii. I love Hawaii. I think it is such an accessible island, especially given it is part of the US. So they do have the ADA in mind. So I do find it's a lot more accessible than, say, some of the Caribbean islands that you would go to. Honestly, Hawaii is one of my favorites. But I think there are still, even though it's part of the US, there's still some major issues. And I'd say especially with transportation. We were there for quite a long time. We were there for 3 weeks. But we didn't rent an accessible vehicle for the whole time. The accessible vehicles cost almost $150 US a day, which is, I think, completely out of reach for most travelers, especially if you're going for a week or 2-week vacation, which is what most people do. So we only actually had an accessible vehicle for 5 days out of the 21 days that I was there. And the rest of the time we were relying on the bus, which is accessible, is actually very accessible, but actually getting to a lot of the sites and attractions we wanted to see weren't accessible by. And the taxis there, you have to pre-book the taxis 24 hours in advance if you need an accessible taxi. And they also charge you extra if you're a wheelchair user. So before the meter even starts, you have to give the taxi driver $30 extra just to load your wheelchair into the taxi. So I think transportation is a massive issue that a lot of people don't realize if they're not traveling with a person with a disability, like how much planning goes into, especially if you don't have an accessible vehicle that you're renting, planning out those bus routes, planning out the taxis, and there's always going to be extra costs associated with traveling if you have a wheelchair versus if you're a completely able-bodied person.
That just seems wrong that they're charging you $30 to load, because they don't charge you $30 to load suitcases. So I would have an issue with that, I think. I'll leave that alone before I get on a rant. So let me ask this question, because I reserved 24 hours in advance an accessible taxi in LA, and guess what? It didn't show up. I'm like, what's the point in reserving it 24 hours in advance? And not only that, they couldn't even tell me if they had one or if they could get me one. So we wound up jamming everything into an Uber, which was a real process. But I find that's fairly typical in the US and a lot of big cities. The buses seem to work pretty well if you can get there. The rest of it's a challenge.
Yeah, for sure. I think that accessible taxis everywhere is such a big problem. But I don't know if you've ever been to the UK. I think you have. But all of their taxis there are completely, fully wheelchair accessible, which is amazing because unlike the US or Canada, you don't have to actually pre-book anything. Every taxi is fully accessible, which means when I was there a couple of years ago, I was literally able to wave down any taxi and just get in. So, you know, that really changes the game for travel, and I wish that that could be integrated more into the US.
Yeah. What are some of the things that you did that were accessible that you thought were a lot of fun?
So when we were in Hawaii, we actually did this one trail. I think the name was the Makapu Lighthouse Trail. I apologize if I'm butchering the name, but I believe that's what it was called. And it was this really amazing trail that was fully paved, and it went right up to the top of a mountain where there was this beautiful lighthouse and an overview of the ocean. Honestly, just such an incredible view. And that was honestly probably one of the most accessible trails that I've ever been on, at least as a power wheelchair user, because it was fully paved, it was so smooth, and it was right in the middle of nature. You were literally going up a mountain. So that was such a cool experience. But it was funny because doing that trail, I was with my friend who is also a wheelchair user, and she's a manual wheelchair user. And for her, she was like, this is one of the least accessible trails I've ever been on. Because even though it was paved, it was completely uphill. And she wasn't able to push herself up that steep incline. So that wasn't something that we thought about ahead of time. So thankfully, she was able to hold on to me and I was able to pull her, and then my other friends were able to push her. But it was an interesting realization for me that what's most accessible for me as a wheelchair user might not be accessible for a manual wheelchair user, and vice versa. I also think that's why it's so important to have this representation in the travel industry, because all of our needs are so unique, and again, what's accessible for you and your wife might not be at all accessible for me.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you mentioned that. I've got a video that's coming up because I went to San Pedro and we were taking a cruise, but I went 2 days early and did some tours. And one of the places we went is called the Korean Bell. And we took the bus because I was trying to show what's accessible, and rather than do a cab, took the bus and got at the bottom of the hill that went up to it. But the hill was about 6 blocks long and about like that.
Yeah.
And I will say this, for me, it was a tremendous challenge getting my wife up. In fact, somebody was walking down the hill and saw me struggling and offered to push and pushed a block or so and gave me a breather, because it was one of those things, once you start up, you don't want to quit. Down was still a little bit of a problem, but it's a whole lot easier to put the brakes on a chair going down. I was steering and she had her hands on her brakes, but it's one of those things you don't expect. What else did you do? Did you find anything in the way of like a beach or something that was accessible, or other cool things?
Yeah. We were staying right in Honolulu, a really wonderful place to stay because it's right on Waikiki Beach, but also in the heart of the city, so you're in walking distance. There's so many amusing restaurants and shops and different entertainment. So there's these blue rubber mats that they don't go all the way down to the water, but they go about 3/4 of the way down to the water. So my friend and I were able to use those and get somewhat close to the water and get on the beach and have a beach day. And then we also went to this place called Hana. It's actually a nature preserve now. So you do have to pay entrance to get in, and you have to book your tickets in advance. So it's $25 a person. But once you get there, they actually have free beach wheelchairs that you can use. So you just go right up to the visitor's desk. And I was able to get a beach wheelchair and have a really lovely day in the water. And it was actually nice that since it is a nature preserve and you have to reserve your spots in advance, they don't let too many people in at once. So it was honestly really nice that even though you did have to pay for entry, it wasn't too overcrowded, it wasn't busy, it was really nice and quiet. And yeah, definitely great accessibility with the beach wheelchairs.
Okay, very nice. So you said beach wheelchair. My wife and I have been playing with beach wheelchairs whenever we can get near one.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a wide variety. So what was this beach wheelchair like?
So it was one of the ones that are able to float in the water. So they have the orange armrests that are flotation devices with the high back. So once you sit in it and someone pushes you into the water, you can stay right in the wheelchair to be able to float.
No, very good. And that's one we haven't tried on some cruises. You see the metal ones with the little small wheels in front and the bigger wheels in back, but those don't float. We tried that. Then we had one that was PVC and it had big wheels in the front and little wheels in the back. That one didn't float. We had another one that for my wife, it was hard for her. Her problem is flexibility. The one we tried that was really difficult for my wife, it was one that we rented, and it sat really low. And so it was almost impossible for her to transfer in and out of the chair because she has real mobility issues. She's got really long legs. She's just not very flexible, and trying to get down into it and then getting up out of it was almost impossible for her. For somebody else, it might have been fine, but it wouldn't float either.
Yeah, I feel like there's so many different types of beach wheelchairs. And I find even like the ones you described, like a lot of the time for me, they sit so upright that for me, I don't have a lot of muscle tone. So if I don't have a proper headrest or a high back that can support my neck, I'm not able to hold my head up outside of my wheelchair, which is completely supported and molded to my body. So for me, that's a lot of the issue. They are great to provide access to the beach, but a lot of the time, people with disabilities are really only comfortable in their own wheelchairs because these chairs just aren't supportive enough for us. So I do wish that, there was more Mobi mats or access mats that allowed us to stay in our own wheelchairs because, like, at the end of the day, that's what's most comfortable for me. I'm sure that's what's most comfortable for your wife as well, just being able to be in our own device whenever possible.
Yeah, so that makes a big difference, having your own device. All of the ones that we looked at, one was a little bit reclined, but the others wouldn't have been very supportive. And for somebody that has no torso control, you'd have to invent some kind of strap to hold them in place to support them. And again, those are the kinds of things that you run into. Okay, so we talked about the beach. What else did you do in Oahu that you thought was a lot of fun?
We went to this really beautiful botanical garden. And what I liked about it was that it's designed that you drive through it with your vehicle. Walking is a challenge for you, or even just rolling in your wheelchair. You can completely stay in your vehicle and be able to drive through this garden and see a lot of it. So that was really incredible. I definitely recommend that. I'd say the downside to that was there was some, not hiking trails, but trails throughout if you wanted to get out of your vehicle. And a lot of them, instead of being paved, were like a loose gravel. So that was an issue for me, being able to get through in my wheelchair. Things like that I kind of wish if they just paved it, it would be so much more accessible to everyone. And I think sometimes a lot of when they're making these spaces, they don't necessarily think about that fact. They just think, oh, it's relatively flat. Everyone can access this. But the material on the ground makes a big impact. Cobblestone versus loose gravel versus paved, if it's relatively flat and not uphill, even just the material that they use to make those pathways still impacts whether a wheelchair user is able to get through or not.
Yeah, even within the range of manual or electric makes a big difference. One place we went to, and again, you think it should be accessible, but downtown New Orleans and near the French Quarter,
Mm-hmm.
that is miserable in a manual wheelchair. I don't know how it would be in a power chair, but in a manual wheelchair, it was miserable because it all slopes down toward the street on a fairly good slope. So you're always trying to point the wheelchair uphill just to go straight. And then it's cobblestones. And my poor wife, I tend to be a little bit of a rubbernecker when I'm pushing her. Those little front wheels on a manual chair, they're not very big.
Yeah.
And you hit a spot where there's a missing cobblestone and it can stop pretty suddenly.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so she was always telling me, pay attention.
My friend is a manual wheelchair user, and I've seen her flip out of her chair numerous times from being on cobblestone or even just uneven asphalt. If you're not really watching where you're going, your wheels can catch and you can flip yourself out really fast.
Yes, and it's not very pleasant.
No.
What did you think about accessibility on
Maui? That was really incredible. Maui, I feel like it's a little bit more quiet. Like, it's not really like a city like Honolulu is. So I did find the buses are accessible, but again, if you're able to afford an accessible vehicle or if you're able to transfer into a regular vehicle, I do find that's a much easier way to get around Maui. Just because it isn't a city, so the bus routes aren't as great as they are in Honolulu. Even the transit stops, they're not super close to the hotels, I find. So I would definitely recommend having a vehicle. I also find that a lot of the attractions in Maui, you would require a vehicle anyway. We did the Heavenly Road to Hana, which was a beautiful drive. It's a drive that you do all day. It took us about probably 10 hours. And it's on this beautiful, windy cliff road that goes all the way up the mountain. And you stop in little towns and little lookout points along the way. And that's one of the main things I would highly recommend doing if you ever go to Maui. But again, you would need a vehicle for that. So if anyone's doing Maui, I would highly recommend budgeting in for a vehicle because I do think it will make your trip much better, just having that flexibility and freedom to not rely on the bus everywhere.
And I could see that very easily. There are some places that what you want to see is so scattered. A good example is you talked about wanting to be able to stop and look at the outlooks. I can't do that on public transportation.
No.
Most tour buses don't stop. One of my favorite drives is driving from Skagway into British Columbia or through British Columbia into the Yukon Territory. And it's every 5 feet, there's something to stop and see. And so you just about have to have your own vehicle to really fully enjoy that trip as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so let's talk about where'd you go in British Columbia?
I went Vancouver and then we drove to Squamish and then we finished in Kelowna. And we did a couple wineries in Kelowna. That was my first. I've been to Vancouver a couple times, but my recent trip was my first time in Kelowna, and it was just absolutely beautiful. Really recommend it.
So, what did you find in the way of accessibility, good and bad?
I love British Columbia. I find that it is very accessible. I think that they have done a really good job integrating accessibility with nature for the most part. I find that there's a lot of really cool and amazing accessible things that you can do as a wheelchair user. Like they have a few accessible gondolas that you're able to go in as a wheelchair user. So when we went to Squamish, I think it's called the Sea to Sky Gondola and Suspension Bridge. And it's a fully accessible suspension bridge. You're able to go right across in my power wheelchair. Yeah, it's amazing. It's really cool how they're able to integrate that accessibility into nature and into these incredible opportunities that in your head you would think you would only have the opportunity to see if they're able to hike up a mountain. But the way that they've been able to integrate that is really cool.
We've been to Vancouver once. We just had half a day there after a cruise. Vancouver seemed to be very easy to get around. We didn't have any trouble finding accessible taxi. We explored I guess it's the Gaslight District.
Yeah.
We went down and saw the steam clock. I thought that was so cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I love Vancouver. I think that same thing. The transportation is really good. They have a lot of accessible taxis, at least in comparison to a lot of the other big cities that I've been to. For example, you definitely seem to be able to get transportation a little bit more easy. They do have a lot of accessible van rental companies. A lot of the public transportation is accessible. Obviously, nothing's perfect, but I do find that it's a city that has put a lot of effort into accessibility, at least in comparison to a lot of other Canadian cities that I've been to. Yeah, it's one of my favorites because it's nice that you get the city and the amazing big city feel of it, but then you can also go 30 minutes out and have incredible views of the mountains and nature. Yeah, I really love it there.
Okay, so for your trip, was it a road trip? So you rented a car?
Yeah, so we didn't drive from Ontario to Vancouver. We just flew into Vancouver. And then we rented an accessible vehicle. And then we drove from Vancouver to Kelowna.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is there anything in Vancouver that you really enjoy doing when you're there?
When we were in Vancouver, we did Stanley Park, which I think is a really cool thing. Just tons of accessible nature trails and beautiful plants and massive trees and just like the most beautiful sights that you wouldn't anticipate placed smack in the middle of a city. So we did a really nice day at Stanley Park. Same thing, we did some shopping and some dining throughout the city. We were only in Vancouver for about 2 days, and then the rest of it was traveling through Squamish. We did the suspension bridge. We also did do 2 nights in Whistler. We were planning on doing the accessible gondola that's in Whistler as well. But when we went there, it was unfortunately just a very rainy and foggy day, and there was no visibility. So we decided not to spend the money going up the gondola if we weren't going to be able to see anything. But that's another gondola that's fully accessible. And then tons of wineries in Kelowna, which I think if you're a wine lover, it's absolutely something that you have to do. It is so unlike any of the wineries that you would go to in Ontario, like so different.
And I'm assuming the wineries were all accessible for you?
Yeah, all the ones that we chose were fully accessible. I did a lot of research just to see what ones that I wanted to go to because we didn't do a wine tour. You can do a lot of them where it's like a tour bus and the tour operator will choose the wineries. But since we had an accessible vehicle, we just decided to map out our own route. And yeah, all of them were very accessible, very accommodating. Yeah, I didn't have any issues at any of the wineries that we went to.
Oh, very nice. Tori, I really appreciate your time today. It's been so nice for you to join me for this chat. Links to your blog and to all of your contact information will be in the description on this video.
Thank you so much for having me.